So I'm Colonel Jackie Powell. I currently am one of the Deputy Commandants here. I look after the University Officer Training Corps.
I'm Colonel Caroline Whittle. I am one of the 3 Deputy Commandants here at Sandhurst, and I look after the reserves because I am a reserve and I've been a reserve for 20 years.
I've been in the Army since I was 17 years old actually, so quite a long time, over 30 years.
My job in Civilian Street is as a veterinary surgeon who looks after horses.
Joining the Army was something which was really at the forefront of my mind from a very young age. I was an Army scholar, so when I was at school I was encouraged by a number of people through my sport actually to take a scholarship into the Army, and so at 15 and a half I trotted to Sandhurst, met up with a whole lot of schoolboys in shorts and knee-length socks. As I was dressed in my suit with my handbag for my interview, ready to go. And I'll be honest, I thought I'm going to smash this. And I did, got my Army scholarship.
I have quite an interesting pathway to get here. I was in a civilian job, horse vet, going to be a horse vet for the rest of my life, but came across vets who were in the reserves to start off with. And then I worked for an NGO for many years in Middle East and Africa. And I came across quite a lot of regular vets. And it was at that point I decided I didn't want to stay in normal practice as a practice owner, which would have been the natural progression. But instead, what I wanted to do was to go and expand and sort of abuse my veterinary degree. And I looked at maybe joining the regulars. However, I was a little bit more canny and decided I will join the reserves and have a look at the regulars. I was very, very lucky that I joined at a time when we were working with the regular cohort very much so, rather than being reserves on our own. We were part of a manpower pool. So my first introduction really to working was straight with the regulars, and straight after my entry officer course I went straight down to work with the embryonic 101 military working dog unit at Buller Barracks with a lot of the RLC, and I had a great time. I went out onto Pilgrim's Progress, worked with the SF, and as the only veterinary officer I got a real good basing in what a regular vet would do. What I did realise, though, with my interactions with the regulars at that point was that clinically the pathway, I would have to step off the clinical pathway at various points, which was the case in those days, and I didn't want to do that. I am fundamentally a clinical vet. That is what I've wanted to do since I was 4 years old, so I decided I would stay in the reserves.
My early role models, what inspired me to join. I did a lot of sport when I was a kid. I used to do modern pentathlon, which is very much a military sport. And I think I joined the Army thinking I was going to be a tracksuit soldier for the rest of my days. Sadly, when I actually joined the Army, I actually enjoyed being an Army officer. So I went straight out to the Balkans and as a second lieutenant at 19 years old, and never really did any of that particular sport again. But certainly my entry into the Army was really all about sporting role models at the time, of which most of the Olympic team were serving in the forces at the time. So yeah, they were my early role models. All men, I hasten to add, but very encouraging nonetheless.
So my role models in life, interestingly, have been mainly women. I think from a very young age, obviously my pathway, I wanted to be a vet from when I was 4. My grandma was a great role model. She was nursing, head of nursing for Lancashire. My mother was a nurse. And also I was very much in awe of the Queen, who I still to this day see as a very great role model for serving and servitude to the nation. In my civilian career, before I joined the Army, I actually came down to the south. I was originally from the north and worked for the Queen as one of her vets for the practice that did all her work in and out of London. And it was at that time that I had my first kind of touch point as well with the military side of ceremonial, etc., and was quite interested in that. But as role models, my main thing was that I saw women as people who worked, and even though I came from potentially a paternal Victorian background who didn't work, I had very, very strong female role models in my life. I was also at the era where Margaret Thatcher was a little bit of a role model, more so because I saw her, I was quite young, but saw her as a woman who was always well dressed and had a commandeering voice and had control over men, which was unheard of really in the sort of northern areas that I came from.
I've been in the Army over 30 years now, and I mean, some of the changes are almost difficult to describe. I'm routinely speaking to officer cadets and I tell them what life was like when I joined the Army 30 years ago, and I think they find it quite hard to believe. Some of those changes have been really, as I say, absolutely seismic. Legislative as well. I mean, when I joined the army, for example, if you got pregnant, you were asked to leave. In fact, no, you were forced to leave. At Sandhurst, you could only be a married male officer cadet, not a married female officer cadet. Of course, none of the combat arms were open. You could only join certain cap badges, such as the gunners and engineers, as a professionally qualified officer. So life's really changed. I mean, opening up all of the roles to women to allow us to do anything that we choose and aspire to do is massive. I speak to you now as a single mother. I would have been thrown out of the army when I joined, but I now manage a career. I manage being a mum of a fairly young child, and the army's allowed me to do that and maintain, obviously, my career as I've been going through. And it's one of those things which I now feel it's a very supportive organisation for people like me and people in circumstances like mine. So, yeah, huge changes.
As a woman in the army, as I say, so my early career, I was very cosseted within the AMS, which is full of women, and it was absolutely great. There was no issues really. But as I came out of the bigger army and became more aware probably of the kind of issues that my colleagues, female colleagues, were having, was almost quite a shock at first, because I hadn't experienced it myself in my early career. But what I did notice is that the Army's willingness to change. They were listening that things needed to change. And it was simple things. Uniforms, I'm not saying they've got the uniforms right still, but they're trying. Kit, I do remember when I first came in as an officer, I had the most humongous Bergen, which I couldn't really carry because my back was too short. Things like that have changed. The biggest change, though, I think, is the voice that we've got. I remember going to the first women's conference, and I sat there as a sort of equals right person and thought, is this too far towards the women, and a little bit, why haven't the men got their own conference? And I sat there thinking to myself, is this something we should be doing? But the second year, as it progressed, I realised this is exactly what we should be doing. We needed to come together as a cohort. We needed to put some sort of gravitas behind the problems we were having, and realise also, just by standing in the Churchill Hall listening to people, that there were high-ranking females, but they weren't particularly noticeable to everybody. But when you went into that forum with everybody there, they were there. And I think they were sort of, the glass ceiling breakers who, for people like me, could then look up to. So there was suddenly someone I could look to and say, oh, actually, even as a reservist, I can look at that person. Brigadier Cecilia stands out as one that I could look at her and think, it is possible. This is somebody who is a reservist. They're not even full-time reserve service. They are a reservist. So there's a lot of changes, I think, gone on. And interesting as my career's gone on, I've had inspiring people and commanders along the way who've been male, but my most inspiring was actually Brigadier Claire Phillips, who was just, joie de vivre and energy personified. And at a time during COVID when I worked for her, I looked at her and thought, gosh, aren't we lucky that we are embracing females in this way, and look what they are doing and bringing everything forward and together. So I can see changes, and I think if I was to ask the male counterparts, who are maybe a little bit older, similar to me, they would say that it's all for positive change.
We tend to go in army careers through postings, really, and I think I would single out two postings that have been highlights of my career. The first one as a captain, when I was here as a platoon commander. I think the privilege of taking young, and at the time it was young women, I had only female platoons while I was here, so being the role model, mentor, and also someone that they can look at critically as well as a leader, taking females through here as a platoon commander was a real high, and I thoroughly enjoyed doing that.
Some of my highlights are very simple things, and one of them was in Civilian Street, I was looking after some of the Queen's horses, and the riding master at the Household Cavalry at the time was Dickie Waygood, and I had avoided working with the Household Cavalry as a bit of a busman's holiday. However, I got commandeered to go and do the veterinary officer job at Bodney Camp for their summer camp, and one morning he was riding a horse called Peter Pan for the Queen at the time, who I was treating in Civilian Street, and he asked me if I wanted to sneak out in the morning and go for a ride on Holcombe Beach. And when we got there, I was expecting to ride one of the mounted regiment horses, but in fact, he put me on Peter Pan. So definitely at a very young age, as a very young captain, I missed an O group that didn't go down very well, but I got to gallop along Holcombe Beach with the riding master as the sunrise came up, and that was pretty awesome.
My next high would be generally as a sub-unit commander, I think. As a sub-unit commander, you're close enough to your soldiers to know them personally, you know their wives, you know how many children they've got, you know the best ones, the worst ones, and everything in between. But you are experienced enough to know your business. I was lucky enough to take my sub-unit on Herrick 10, so right in the middle of the kind of height of Afghan fighting, running the combat logistic patrols, and it was me doing what I trained for the 16 years previously, surrounded by people who were also trained to do exactly what I was, and some really great people. And you see, I think operations in that kind of intensity brings out the very best in our soldiers, because that's what our training delivers them for. So yeah, huge privilege to do that as a sub-unit commander.
If I go on in time, the next one really was riding in front of the Queen, and it's quite interesting that my highlights have been riding and being an officer as well, but I got to ride in front of the Queen in 2014 at the Royal Windsor Horse Show, where I am a veterinary surgeon anyway, but I had the day off, and it was so lovely to be riding in front of the Queen with the Defence Army Training Centre team, and also have my civilian vets who work there see me in uniform on a horse. The fact that the horse dumped me at the first jump in the actual competition really was not relevant. And also my dad got to see me, who was really quite anti-horses at that point, but kind of enjoyed the idea that I was in uniform, kind of made it okay. And then there is one other thing that I did that really stands out as a highlight in career, other than command, etc., is when I was in command the first time, the Commandant, funnily enough, at Sandhurst, I was part of the Sandhurst group at an OTC, and the Commandant was away, and so I got a phone call early in the morning, and we were going particularly through difficult times, as we all do at the time, budgets, etc. And my EXO, my executive officer, was having a pretty tough time. Anyway, I pulled him into my office, and he thought he was going to get told off about something, which wasn't my way. And I got to tell him that he got an MBE, and that was absolutely one of the highlights of my career, to tell someone when they were having a tough time. And I only got to do that because of the position I was in as CO and the fact that the Commandant actually was away and wanted someone to give it personally. So that was an absolute highlight that I still talk about today.
I think everyone faces challenges, no matter who they are, what gender they are, what ethnicity they are. And when I joined the army, I was only 19 years old. So when I first arrived at my unit, I went straight out to the Balkans as a 19-year-old officer, you know, a very young, inexperienced individual who really knew very little about the world. So I wasn't just an inexperienced female, I was just a young person. And I learnt an awful lot on that tour. It was very challenging, living in the environment that we were living in. This is before, you know, Corimex and expeditionary warfare. You know, we were very much living off of what we had in the trailers in our vehicles. It was freezing cold. I was a long way from home. I was homesick. We had no telephones, no mobile phones, no Wi-Fi signal, and it was quite isolating. But I'm not sure that was necessarily a gender thing. And then other challenges that I faced, I mean, as commanding officer, I think you make some really difficult challenges in quite an isolated place from being a commanding officer. They're very different challenges, not necessarily physical, but they really kind of test your, I suppose, your moral compass. They test who you think you are, where your standards sit. And again, I think those were some of the biggest challenges. They're definitely probably the things that have led me to the most sleepless nights, but I wouldn't say that any of them have been specifically about my gender. I've been really lucky to be part of the Royal Logistic Corps because my cat badge in particular it's really being a female has never been an issue in the cat badge that I was lucky enough to join or chose to join. And so it's always been very much integrated. It's always been, you know, people have always stood on their merits. And again, as I say, I feel very proud to be going back as the Corps Colonel because it's certainly been an organisation where I've always found, you know, my brothers and sisters in arms have always been very united in that way.
I think my challenges haven't always been as a woman. I think they've been a combination of being a woman, a reservist, and as a professionally qualified officer. And I think the combination of those three has really set up for a few uncomfortable conversations or potentially being disregarded in some respect as to what I maybe bring to the party. So I couldn't really take out completely that it's about me being a woman in this instance. But the kind of things really is that sometimes you don't have a voice. I come from an all-girls school, so I was used to sort of standing up and talking for myself. However, there'll be times when you were shouted down a little bit in meetings, and I don't mean that as in physically shouting, but you would just be sidelined, and your input wouldn't be considered as important because you weren't somebody who was considered to be as knowledgeable maybe as a reservist and as a woman in certain instances, and definitely as a PQO. I think was probably one of my biggest barriers when I left sort of the security of the Army Medical Services to come out into the bigger army, looking at other, not as a vet, but I definitely then had very many barriers to trying to make people listen to me or realise that I had something that was really valuable to say.
What memories do I reflect on as an officer cadet? My life has changed. We had a lot of fun here as officer cadets. I mean, I do remember it being really tough because I was very young. I was actually really homesick here. It was the first time I'd left home, so I was desperately homesick. I was completely wide-eyed and naive about what being at Sandhurst, what commanding soldiers, what leadership really meant. And I grew up an awful lot. I mean, this was effectively my university education as I came through here. We had such a good time in certain elements of it, though. I was lucky to be here with one of the princes of Jordan, and we spent a month in Jordan doing adventure training and generally seeing the world. So that was kind of in terms of experiences in the army. I mean, I think that was probably one of when I leave in 37 years in service, I think that will be one of my highlights. But just being around like-minded people, being around it, at the time I was in a female platoon, and being around like-minded girls was great fun, just generally great fun. And a number of the people that I met there are still people that I come into contact with now. So yeah, being around like-minded people, male and female, was a fantastic opportunity to do so young. And I look back on it now with really fond memories. Perhaps at the time, maybe less so. I did find it quite tough here. I was very young when I was an officer cadet here, and I found the basics in life really quite difficult.
So my time when not at work, I would put my hands up and say I'm someone who likes to fill my time. I always have been. My civilian job is, with rotas, etc. It's a vocational job. It's not a job that I pick up and put down. So most of my time off also involves horses. I think the more I've swayed the balance towards either half and half, or maybe slightly some years more army than civilian, my time off has been more precious. It's still spent with my two horses, doing very mundane things outdoors, mucking out, picking up poo in fields. But what would be my most precious time, if I could really do it, which I feel quite decadent, is to literally shut my phone off and sit and read a book at home, which I do feel a little bit guilty about, and I'm learning to cope with that. But reading is something that I do enjoy doing for time off too.
I'm a single mum, so I've got a 9-year-old. He's away at boarding school during the week, but I tend to spend my sort of free time at the weekends, certainly with him. I've recently taken up High Rocks, which is fitness racing. So in my free time, I'm either in the gym or asleep or eating something, really. I like to spend time with family and friends. I think the great thing about the military is you end up with a network of people all over the country. So if I'm not looking after my son or dragging my poor son around to various places around the country, I'm meeting up with friends, catching up with people that I sometimes haven't seen. And as I say, you create friendships which you can just latch onto year in, year out. And many of my friends have been friends that I've known for sort of 30 years, and mostly through the army, to be fair.
It's really interesting. I really struggle to blow my own trumpet, and I would like to think that the person to ask is the people that I maybe inspire, what inspires them. If I was to give some feedback, it's mostly, I think, my fairness, maybe compassion, and I would hope that the way I am, which is quite neutral across the board with no favouritism to people, would inspire other people to know that, it doesn't matter who you are, what you bring to the table, you can be everything you want.
I think it is really important that we're very visible role models as we've come through our careers, and at the end of the day, I'm coming towards the end of mine now, but I think being out there, being visible, and the term authenticity, it just comes up every time. I think the ability to be yourself in the military, to not try and conform to what other people think you are. I always try and be an authentic leader myself. It sounds a bit crass, but I try and be who I am, and you know, so far so good, I suppose. Haven't been caught out yet. Always mildly rebellious, but I think just be authentic, and other people hopefully will see that in you, and that will inspire them to be the best that they can possibly be as well. So definitely a big element being a role model, and quite proud to be a role model for more junior females coming through, because they've got an awful lot to offer.
It's more about people inspire me every day, and that kind of surprises me. The new generation coming through, just every day I'm amazed. An example, this week I was out visiting Commissioning Corps Short, and there was a lovely, very young nurse, regular officer cadet coming through, and she was having a tough time. She'd been put in as platoon commander, and she'd tears, there'd been all kinds of stuff. But when I went to talk to her to kind of give her that one-to-one woman, superior to subordinate chat, all I could look at when I looked at her, and she was really struggling, was, I'm amazed you have been in the field for 3 days and your eyeliner is perfect. That really impressed me, because here is somebody who was so confident about her own, what she'd do in the morning. Her admin was amazing, and the rest we can teach her, whereas I'd have been sort of the mucky one that wouldn't even have thought about it. So the words I gave her were very much, you can do this, cry if you want to, it doesn't matter, be a woman, be authentic, and guess what? The army of today will accept all of those, because what they want from you is the skill you're bringing, not the way you bring it.
I've had an most amazing time over as I say, this is what I've done for my entire adult life. And I think if you want the opportunity to be surrounded by like-minded people every day, the opportunity to do something different every couple of years as well, I think for me it's all about the people that I've worked with, particularly I kind of sum up my army career in that I've dealt with some very young soldiers with all sorts of problems in their lives, and their backstories are really quite tragic, all the way up to working here with Officer Cadet Wales, Prince Harry as an Officer Cadet, and meeting numerous members of the royal family, and every single element that's in between. This is a people game fundamentally. So if you're into people, you like making a difference every day, you like a challenge every day, and you like working with like-minded people who quite frankly don't always take themselves too seriously, and it gives you a job that still, after 31 years, I still enjoy getting up in the morning. And I'm really honest about this when I speak to my civilian friends. I don't really ever feel like I've got a proper job, and that's a great job, right?
My advice to anybody at all, but certainly females thinking about coming as an army officer, is, look at what it is that you have in your life. When I looked at it, for me, it was, what does this company have that I want? And it was the values and standards that aligned to my own moral compass at that time. And what I would say is there are so many opportunities even now, in this austerity area that we're in. The army still is a good offer for both regular and reserves. For women, you have got a voice. There's a great cohort of women who think the same, want to get out and do things. The opportunities for whether you're, single, married, etc., certainly the reserve space is absolutely, boundless now. You will have to put up with a few things. We're not quite there fully on the women, kit and clothing being one of them. But in terms of, from a woman, what you get for it, what I've got is it's pushed me out of my comfort zone into places I wouldn't have gone as a civilian, even as a horse vet, and I was quite tough and outdoorsy. But in terms of making feel my networks and understanding other people, it has definitely sort of stretched me there as well, to look at all types of people differently, especially other women.